Hello and everyone and welcome. Thank you so much for coming out to participate in our summer 2023 FCI live series. I know most of us have already had long days before this session, so I'm very, very glad to see you. We had a lot of registration for this one, so clearly this topic hit a nerve. This is going to be Proforma 101 for startup boards, very much aimed at more and more people coming in here, very much aimed for those who are not financial professionals, talking about how to understand the Proforma and some basics about it as someone who is responsible for it to a degree as the board of a startup, right? So even if you're not the treasurer yourself, the board has a financial responsibility to understand what the heck they're getting their community into financially. And we have Siobain Mitchell here to help you understand that from her lengthy experience as the board president of Siobain Food Co-op that opened just last month, and as also as a finance professional. So just before we get started with her, I'm going to jump into a little tiny bit of housekeeping. If you've not been with us before in one of these, we do ask that you mute now, check that you are muted and make sure you are, because it can affect the sound quality because we are recording. And the number one question, of course, I always get is, are you recording? We'll be able to see this later. Can I share this with people? The answer is yes, yes, and yes. We are recording these sessions. I will be emailing them out the afternoon of Monday, July 3rd, the link to where they are on the FCI Food Co-op Initiative YouTube page, which is where they will all be, just like all the ones from all our previous series, which you can see there now. We will email out a link to where they are so you can find them to absolutely anyone and everyone who has registered for an FCI live session. So if you are here, you're going to get that email the afternoon of Monday, July 3rd with the link, and you'll be able to see all the videos from the series. Real quick, I want to give a shout out and a thanks to our champion sponsor, National Co-op Grocers, for making our summer 2023 FCI live series possible. Thanks to them. All right, I am not going to talk much longer here. I'm going to hand this over to the person you came to see, and that would be Siobain Mitchell. Siobain, thanks so much for being here tonight.
All right, well, thank you for having me, and thank you all for being here on a Tuesday evening, probably after work. So I thought that we would start. I just wanted to get a quick sense of who's here. I see a couple people that I recognize. So hi, Stuart Reed. I don't think he's here for the Proforma 101 in the sense that maybe the rest of you are, but I thought we would just do a couple quick polls and see where we're at. So let's see, JQ.
Yep, I got it.
You're gonna, okay.
All right. So asking, what stage of development is your co-op in, or are you not with a startup food co-op at all? All right, answers coming in. Waiting for a few more. Good, good. Give everyone just one more minute. Most people have answered. All right. There we go.
Okay. And then do we share the results or can everybody see them?
Hopefully everyone can see them. It says it's sharing them. Yep,
okay.
People are nodding.
Yep, cool. Okay, so some stage oneers, some stage 2A, a couple stage 2B. Excellent, okay.
So and have Julie with him.
Okay. So actually, maybe in between doing poll number 1 and poll number 2, I'll just quickly go through how I like to do some of the housekeeping when I do one of these. So I'm gonna have a slideshow. I'm gonna go through. I actually encourage people to ask me questions as I'm going along. But what I would like for you to do is to keep yourself muted and to raise your hand using the raise hand function on Zoom. I think we're all pretty good at that by now. And or to type your questions in the chat. And that way we don't have a couple people trying to jump in at the same time. Okay, so I know a little bit more about you. Let's do that second poll real quick.
Okay. Wait, it disappeared on me. Hold on. there it is. All right, and back. Here we go. All right, so this one's about your comfort level with Proformas. And again, let's have the startups answer this one. Let's not skew the room with all you. I see some experienced folks in here besides just Stuart. So
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Yeah, that is a problem.
all right, so we got most people have it. So I will share the results. There you go.
Okay. So so we've got a good mix. We have people who have never seen one of these before. We have people who have looked through one or have one, and then we have people who are actually in them working. They're pro forma. So that's really good. So hopefully tonight there will be something for all of you in this presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and start my PowerPoint. And let's see, this thing always blocks me. There we go. So yes, so I know a little bit about you, and I'll tell you a little bit more about me. So again, my name is Siobain Mitchell. I was one of the startup organizers for Siobain Co-op Market, which has been opened just shy of a month. And actually, I am now working at my co-op. I am the finance manager there. So I have a full-time job now at the co-op, so that is very exciting. And then in my copious free time, I do consulting work, and pro forma work is some of the work that I really love to do. It's some of my favorite work. So we're here for Pro Forma 101. I'm going to start. So what is this thing? Well, I'll give you the definition. Okay. So financial feasibility, which is what we're all after, right? It's determined through building an in-depth financial pro forma that includes a sources and uses development budget for the pre-opening phase of the co-op, and then projects detailed financial performance through the co-op's first 10 years of operations. The projections include balance sheet, income statement, statement of cash flows, debt service schedule, and key metrics and ratios. So we're done, right? You got that? Okay, so here's what happens, I think, when you get this thing. So you get this thing. Oh, let's see, can I advance? There we go. So you get this thing and you open it up and you look at it. Yeah, it's coming. And it's a giant Excel workbook and it's full of tabs. And every tab is a giant spreadsheet and it's full of numbers. And it is a lot to take in, right? So I just want to kind of step back and just talk a little bit about what's happening kind of conceptually with this thing, right? And this, I think, is a little bit easier to kind of understand, right? So you have these key financial statements, right? And hopefully you're familiar with them at this point. You have your balance sheet, your profit and loss, and your statement of cash flows. What this workbook, what this giant Excel workbook is doing is it's taking information that we're giving it, right? And you know, depending on who your consultant is, there may be a couple different tabs where that information is being entered. I think with the Columinate Proformas, there's one tab that's just your sources and uses budget. And I think you have a different tab for sales and then another one for margins and labor. In mine, all of the inputs are happening on a single tab, just because I think it's a little bit easier to kind of approach that way. So all of this information is being fed into this thing. What are your sales going to be? How much are you going to be paying in rent, right? And then that information is flowing into these financial statements, right? And then information is also coming into your financial statements from your debt schedule, right? Because chances are you're going to have debt You might have a couple different kinds of debt even. You might have member loans and an equipment loan and blah, blah, blah. So the financial statements, all of this information is being fed into the financial statements. And again, that's 10 years worth of projections for your co-op. And then what we do with this thing is we pull out some of these outcomes for you, right? All these outcomes, and we're going to go through and we're going to talk about the different outcomes and the different things that we look at. They all live somewhere in those financial statements. But rather than making you go through and try to find them all, we pull them out and we put them in a single kind of consolidated place for you so that you can see them all together. And that also makes it easier as information changes. You can see how your outcomes are changing. So that's kind of what's happening conceptually with this thing. Okay, so yeah, outcomes. So let's talk about outcomes. So all of these, again, are pulling from different places in the financial statements. So one of the first things that we like to look at and talk about is cash. Cash is really important. If you run out of cash, you don't stay open, right? So how much cash you have, and again, that's cash at the end of the year. And we measure it in the grocery world. We measure that in days in cash. So you actually get both numbers. And then you also are given your total cash flow for the year. So you can see, is your cash going down year after year after year? Is it going up? Is it doing some of each, right? Now, the next thing that I want to kind of call out specifically here is something called EBITDA. And that is an accounting term. And basically, what it is, it's your net income from operations. So this is the story of the store. How is the store doing? Now, it's different from the next metric on the list, which is your kind of your bottom line net profit or loss, right? That's at the very bottom of that income statement. Are you showing an actual profit for the year or not? And bottom line profitability very often comes later, right? You might start having positive EBITDA. You might start having positive income from operations, but still have that bottom line net loss. And that's because of what EBITDA is. It's not taken, there's a couple things that it's not accounting for. And one of those is your interest payments on your loans. And we'll come back to this again. I have a couple slides farther down, and I'll kind of walk you through how that works. And then we look at some ratios, right? I think it's good to have some ratios to look at and to understand how your metrics are measuring up, right? And how they're measuring against a goal, right? Or a certain level of goodness, maybe that one of your lenders is going to want to see in your pro forma before you get a loan. So there are, of course, tons of ratios in this thing, but there's just a couple that we typically pull out and we put for you in that kind of consolidated outcomes area. And then, what you're really asking when you're talking about financial feasibility, the question that you're really trying to answer is, how good is good enough, right? There are some co-ops out there, there are some startups out there both, through a lot of hard work and circumstances, that they've been able to get a lot of free money, right? That's not true for everybody. And there's the occasional startup that has a market study that says that their first year sales are going to be, $8, $9, $10 million. Again, that's not the story for the majority of startups, right? So you are unlikely to have a pro forma that is a complete home run, right? So you're going to be going through this thing and you're going to be looking at it and you're going to be talking about it amongst yourselves. And the question that you're going to be asking is, how good is good enough, right? And that's one of the reasons that we kind of pull out these outcomes for you, so you can see and then compare and see how it changes. So there's kind of three phases that happen when you work with the pro forma. And this first phase, obviously, is when you first get it. And when you first get it, it's a tool, right? It's a tool for you to use to model different scenarios. And you're changing, it's going to be very clear to you which cells you can change the numbers in, right? And you get to play around with it, right? And you get to say, well, what happens if we get a grant? Or what happens if our rent is $10 a square foot? What happens if it's $15 a square foot, right? So you're playing around with it. You're trying to come up with some combination of assumptions that starts to give you a financial outcome that looks promising, right? And then still using it as a tool, now you're going to start using it to make some decisions, okay? How big, where, what kinds of programming, how much debt, and then decisions about how you want to bring in money from your owners, which again, most startups do. So is that going to be owner loans? Maybe it's going to be preferred shares, right? Because those things are going to have different impacts on those financial projections. So that's kind of like the first phase of working with your pro forma. And then the second phase is you've kind of figured out some combination of assumptions, and you're like, yep, okay, we're going to do this thing. And we're going to go out and we're going to start looking at sites, and we're going to secure a site. We're going to start getting real numbers. We're going to start getting actual bids for the construction. And then at some point, you're kind of finalizing your pro forma, okay? You're approving it as a board. And then you're sending it when you start applying for loans, when you start applying for grants. All of these people are going to want to see your pro forma financials. And then assuming that you are going to your owners for some money, you'll be putting together some kind of an offering memorandum. And so you'll be pulling financial information out of your pro forma, and it goes in that document as well, right? And then, the third phase is, what we're all working towards. You're open, okay? And you have this pro forma, and the pro forma says, well, here's the projections. This is what we think your sales are going to be. This is what we're saying your margin needs to be and your labor needs to be. And then there's the reality of the actual store actually operating and being open for business. So you're holding your GM accountable to this pro forma, but you're using it, you're comparing the actuals. You're comparing your actual sales to your projected sales. So you're trying to keep very close, you're keeping a very close watch on that. is it a match, or is there a big difference, right? So that's kind of the three phases in the life of a pro forma. So let's see, we're going to get into some concepts here. Okay, so we have a fake co-op. So our community food co-op, and our community food co-op is going to be about 4,500 square feet of retail. It's going to be about 7,200 square feet total, because we really wanted to have a little community space. So we're just going to have, a couple hundred square feet. It's just going to be a big empty room, and we can do things. Okay, so we're going to start inputting information into this pro forma. And again, we're starting in our inputs tab, in our sources and uses tab. And we're going to start with our sources and uses because it's a great place to start. So it's not set up precisely this way, but I think the easiest way to think about this is how much money you bring in minus how much your project costs. That's your starting cash, right? So in this scenario, we're going to pretend that our co-op, that we were able to bring in about 3.63 million. Now, there's a lot of sources, there are a lot of options in the sources and uses tab for different kinds of sources that you might have. And there are lots of different ways and places that you can get funding. And so that's part of the work of being in stage 2, is really starting to think about that capital stack and how you're going to put it together. So we're just going to assume that, there's maybe a small grant here, maybe we got a tenant improvement allowance, but what I'm calling out specifically is that of that 3.63 million, there's some debt, right? So we went to our owners and we did an owner loan campaign. And so we brought in $1.8 million, and those are in loans, right? We have an equipment loan, $650,000. And we were able, in this pretend universe, we were able to get a community loan, and we're super excited about that because it's interest only for the first year, and it's a rate that's below market. So the total cost of our project for our community co-op is about 3.17. So we're going to start with about $460,000 in cash. So that's pretty good, maybe. So the next concept that I want to just talk about for a minute is the concept of margin minus labor. JQ, you're smiling. This is a really important concept. And so, when you're talking about financial feasibility and the outcomes in your pro forma, it's really this combination of sales and margins and labor. Those are kind of driving the bus. And if you change any of these, even in a small way, you get a pretty dramatic change in your outcomes. But I just want to go through real quick, especially if there's people here who are not familiar with this concept yet. So if your margin is 35%, and again, I'm using just whole numbers that are kind of easy, right? But if your margin is 35%, what that means is that out of every dollar, you had to spend 65 cents to buy your inventory, to purchase the stuff that you are selling in your store. So if your margin is 35%, what that's really saying is you only have 35 cents left out of every dollar, okay? Now, your labor is also expressed as a percentage. And if your labor is 20%, it's not 20% of the 35 cents that's left, it's 20% of sales. So it's 20% of that original dollar. So if your margin is 35 and your labor is 20, out of every dollar in sales, you have 15 cents left. And that 15 cents has to do everything else. So everything else includes paying for all of your occupancy expenses, right? So that's rent, utilities, insurance. If you're going to purchase a building, which is not as common, but some co-ops do it, you have a mortgage, right? Property taxes, operating expenses. This is not the full list. These are just some selected highlights out of all the various costs that it takes to run your store. But everything from store supplies, software, advertising, promotions. And then even after all of that, it has to service your debt. Remember the debt? All those owner loans and that equipment loan and that community loan. There needs to be money left out of that 15 cents to pay that debt. So I do want to just take just a quick second here to just say that this is, I think, one of the reasons why it really is important to use a pro forma consultant that understands retail grocery, that understands food co-ops. And you may have an accountant on your board or one in your community that is volunteering for you, right? And saying, oh, I'll put together this thing for you. And you know, my answer to that is kind of yes, and. Somebody who, if they're an accountant or if they're just a finance professional, and if they know how to use Excel, they could put something together for you. But what they're not really going to have is this kind of thorough understanding of all of the teeny tiny little details that go into a food co-op's operations. And so we really do strongly suggest that you use a trusted provider, right? Let's see, what is on my next slide? Okay, so I wasn't certain how well this would play. I hope it's not too hard to see. And I apologize if you're looking at this on your phone. You're probably going to have a hard time reading this, but I did wanted to show you something of what the pro forma looks like, but you can't really look at a pro forma on a tiny little Zoom. You just can't. So this is a very, very, very simplified, consolidated income statement, right? Remember, there's three. We have the balance sheet, the income statement, and the statement of cash flows. So this is an example, a very consolidated example of an income statement. So we start with our sales, right? And you may be thinking, hey, Siobhan, I thought you said, our co-op had, $3.5 million in sales in the first year. And your market study may say that, but we actually discount sales in the pro forma, and that's a really important thing that we do. We take the sales that are in your market study, and we whack 20% off the top. And partly we do that because we want this thing to be as conservative as possible. We want to model something that is less than everything going perfectly right? Because we want you to be able to survive if there are bumps in the road. And there are plenty of co-ops that open and their sales are a little bit below. And there's reasons for that, right? So we reduce your sales. So again, this is a giant spreadsheet that I've tried to shrink down. So we have our cost of goods sold, right? And then we're paying for our labor, right? So the next thing on this list is occupancy. And I've circled it because doesn't it look weird? And you might be thinking to yourself, gee, my co-op would not sign a lease if it was going to cost us $663,000 a year to rent this building. And the answer is that that's not everything that's going into this number. So we've hit yet another concept, and that's the concept of depreciation. And what depreciation is, because the IRS likes to make all kinds of really complicated rules. What the IRS says is that there are expenses that you can't just deduct from your income the year that they happen, right? So let's say, and this is occupancy, but let me use the example of a piece of equipment. So let's say I've got a small business, not even necessarily a food company, but I've got a small business. And I have expenses, I pay for the telephone, I pay for, copying, I pay for my Zoom account, I do that. And the IRS says, yes, you can deduct that, you can deduct that, you can deduct that. And then I say, well, I bought this giant fancy computer. And the IRS says, nope, you can't deduct it. You can't just list it as an expense on this year's taxes. We're going to treat it as an asset, okay? And you can achieve cost recovery for an asset, but you have to do that over time. So you have to deduct the cost of the purchase of that, whatever it is, that giant fancy computer, over the quote unquote life of that asset. So if it has a 7-year life, if it was a $7,000 computer, I am now writing off $1,000 a year for the next 7 years, right? And that's really how depreciation works. So what you have is you have this mismatch. You're now mismatched in time, because I have the year where I spent the money to buy the computer, but that is not the year that it's coming off as an expense on my taxes. Instead, it's coming off in subsequent years in equal chunks over the life of the asset. So in this, coming back to this pro forma, what we have here under occupancy, it's not just the cost of the rent. We are also depreciating what we spent to create the store. All of our building improvements are being expensed over a very long period of time. And it's showing up on your income statement because it is being deducted from your income. And so this co-op, this particular startup, has net income from operations, and it's a giant loss. And actually over these 7 years, they have losses in their net income from operations, right? Now the losses are getting smaller and smaller, so that's good. That's a good trend. But part of why, and in this and some other examples, I am showing you pro formas that are not perfect. I'm showing you pro formas from startups where they have not figured it out yet. And I'm doing that on purpose, not to scare you, but I'm doing it because chances are when you get your pro forma, the first one, it's not going to look good, right? And that's okay. That's how you start. And then you work with it and you start playing with those assumptions and you start figuring out how to make those outcomes better and better and better. So this is not a pro forma that would be ready to go to a bank, right? This is not a pro forma that you would probably approve. You're not throwing a dance party over this thing, but this doesn't mean that you have to throw up your hands and give up, right? It just means that we need to play around with it some more, okay? So we have negative net income from operations, but then we actually are still sending those payments to the bank. So the interest that we're paying on our debt is then yet another deduction against our income. And so our bottom line profit and loss is a loss. And it's a loss all the way out. So let me, you know what? Let me stop here. I think, I've been talking for a while. Let me stop and just ask if there are any questions, and it's okay if there aren't. But if there are questions or if somebody wants to throw something in the chat, otherwise, keep going. Do you see anything?
We had a question about community loan funds a while back, early on, just what an example is of a community loan fund, what that means versus a regular lender.
Yeah, oh, that's a great question. So, it really depends on what's around in your community, but a lot of communities have what's called like an EDC, an economic development. And sometimes those EDCs will also have funds that they loan to promote economic development. So you may be able to get a kind of below market loan from an EDC. It may be that your municipality has a business development. You're just going to have to kind of look around. And JQ, I don't know if you wanted to add, I don't know if you want to add CDFIs to that list or.
So CDFIs aren't always a community loan fund necessarily. CDFIs usually don't have the lowest interest rates out there. So I think what you're talking about is mostly EDC money, economic development corps. Most communities have those. Now we've got a bunch of people. Now questions are showing up.
Yay!
Why are occupancy expenses so high in year one if many of those expenses will be depreciated over time? And that question showed up from 2 people.
Oh, good. That is a great question. And so let's see if I can explain the answer in a good way. So I guess the first thing is that this is a very smushed down version of a much longer, more complicated income statement. There is kind of a lot happening with depreciation. And your depreciation in year one is going to be a larger dollar amount than it's going to be in subsequent years. And hopefully that's enough of an answer. But yes, you're right. That's an excellent observation.
We have some requests for, I'd love you to take this one. So I'll answer where I was typing, but I'll answer for the first part. You answer second. Nancy wants to know, said, great explanation so far. Thank you. Does FCI have a blank template with the workbook tabs you're referring to? Now I'm going to first say, we have a template for what is called the sources and uses, which is one portion of what a full pro forma has and is involved in it. We don't have a blank template or a template of any kind for a full pro forma, and I will let Siobain answer why.
Yes. Well, a couple of reasons. One is that it does take a fair amount of skill and professional competency to put one of these together and work with it. 2, they're going to be different, right? Different co-ops, different communities, depending on the size depending on what kind of programming you're going to have, your pro forma might look very different from a pro forma that that I or Columinate would do for another startup, even in your state, right? So there's not really a template. There's not a template that would be accessible enough and easy enough for somebody to just download and use. You really do need somebody who has knowledge of operations, right? Who can go in and say, this is what your margins are likely to be. This is what your labor, this is what you should be doing for your labor. And also modeling loans. Modeling loans is very tricky. There's lots of different kinds of loans out there. And if you get a loan from a lender, most of the co-op lenders aren't banks in the traditional sense of the word bank, but they are lenders. So the Cooperative Fund of the Northeast, Shared Capital, LEAF, NCB. Well, I guess NCB is a bank. Now, those loans are going to work like if you have a car loan or if you have a mortgage, right? But member loans, there's a lot of options for how you structure them. You have a lot of choices that you can make. And going back to like this idea of the EDC loan, if it's interest only, it would be really challenging, I feel like, for a startup to try to model that on their own, right? The other thing about having a pro forma professional that you work with is you get to talk to them. You get to interact with them, right? I mean, I'm here with you tonight for an hour. You guys have me for 17 more minutes. But clearly, when you go to actually get your pro forma, you're really partnering with that professional, right? Financial feasibility it's a big deal, right? This is our, these are our babies, right? We have this vision that we want to open this store. And we really want to know that it's going to open and stay open, right? We want these things to thrive. I want my co-op to be around for my children, right? I know it sounds sappy maybe, but it's true. So when you're partnering with a former professional, you're engaging with them and they're helping you work through your feasibility. They're offering suggestions, they're offering advice, right? And I think that that's really invaluable.
Great. I'm going to take this next one real quick, which was kind of, is it appropriate to ask an accountant to create a pro forma, or is there another pro forma professional one would go to? So I'm going to put in the pitch here is that, first off, these are far too complicated to do yourself. They are not something that even most accountants know how to build necessarily. But even when I have worked with startup food co-ops, there was a startup food co-op that had a professional. What they did is they built Proformas for a living. That's what they did. They were in the business. They were in a business industry. They were on the board. They very purposely hired someone else to build their pro forma with them and walk through it, because as they said, is what I understand is the inner workings of a pro forma and how maybe to put one together, but not all the factors that build a grocery store that should go into it and what are reasonable assumptions. So it's really, and I love this story because it's really, and so she did, take a lot of hours off of their pro forma contract by being able to fix some things and do some things herself. But she actually, more than anyone, wanted to work deeply in partnership with somebody who had not only the financial expertise to build a pro forma, but had deep expertise in specifically the food co-op industry and its unique turns and twists about what is realistic in operating the business. So it sounds like, if you haven't worked, there are a couple people who I think are even on the call who do pro formas, who specifically work extensively with food co-ops, and you can reach out to me, jq@fci.coop. I put in the chat, and we can give you some contact information for folks who do pro formas with food co-ops. It's one of the places, like, again, we're the nonprofit. We don't need a kickback from this. This is one of the few places I'll tell you there are only a couple people we would recommend out there because it's such a specific skill set. Now, should we let you keep presenting?
Yeah. Thank you for answering that question though, too, JQ. I appreciate it. Yeah, let me see. Let's keep going. Let's see what I've got on my next slide. Oh, okay. So coming back to outcomes, right? So we were just looking at, we were talking about income from operations. We were talking about net profit or loss. But what that didn't tell us was how much cash do we have? How are we doing with cash, right? So coming back to this idea of margin minus labor, right? And only having so many cents out of every dollar. So coming back to our kind of pretend our community food co-op, with our 3.5 billion of sales, after we've bought the stuff to sell and we've paid all our employees, we have $400,000 left. Now, we're going to be paying about $150,000 in occupancy. We're going to be paying about $275,000 in operating, and we still have to pay our debts. Don't forget about the debts. That's going to be another $75,000. So, well, what happened? Our cash flow for the year is negative, right? We started with, $460,000 in cash, right? If you recall from the early slide, which you probably don't. Right? And after our first year, our cash flow for that year was negative. It was a negative $100,000. And now our ending cash is only $360,000. And you're like, uh-oh. And I'm like, well, no, actually, this is fine. This is exactly what you would expect for a year one, right? So that's the other thing that when we talk about financial feasibility, it doesn't happen in year one, right? Year one always looks really bad. You're gonna have an operating loss, right? You're not gonna have positive net income from operations. You're not gonna have a positive cash flow, and you're certainly not gonna have bottom line net profitability. So that's part of understanding and part of working with a professional is saying, oh yeah, we would expect this. This is okay. If you're losing $100,000 a year, every year, not okay, right? Because again, if you run out of cash, you close. But for a first year, this would be actually, you would expect this, right? So I think my next slide, and I'm hopefully, if we're not there, I think I might skip to it. Oh yeah, well, let's do, yeah. So cash. So this is again, a consolidated cash flow statement from a different co-op. So this co-op is starting the year one with $455,000. And their cash flows from operations are negative. Cash flows from investments, that's stuff like money spent on building improvements, maybe some small equipment purchases, stuff like that. But then look what happens. Cash flow from equity activities, right? People are still joining, right? So you have people coming in, they're still joining your co-op. You're actually getting that cash coming in the door, not showing up on your income statement, right? Because equity doesn't come in as income, but it's showing up, it's coming in and it's showing up in cash. It's showing up in your cash flow statement. And then of course, there's our actual debt service payment. So what you can see here, this on the bottom is actually pretty typical. It's a pretty typical cash flow for the first, and again, the pro forma has 10 years. I was really concerned that if I tried to get 10 years onto a slide, that it would be just too miserable to look at. So this is just the first 7. So we do have a negative cash flow in the beginning, but by year 3, we're generating positive cash. And at the end, our ending cash, that very bottom line, that is looking really healthy over those 7 years. So yes, there's some fluctuations, but it's looking pretty good. So let me move on. This is where I wanted to get to. This is what a consolidated picture of your outcomes, all of those outcomes together in one place. This is what it's going to look like. Now, again, I'm showing you an example of a co-op that hasn't They haven't figured it out yet, right? So you can see they're running out of cash, right? They're doing well in the beginning, but then they start to run out of cash. In year 6, year 7, by year 8, they've run out of cash, and actually they've closed, right? They've closed in year 9 because you can't run a business with a negative $100,000 in the bank. But this co-op is not giving up, and nor should they, right? They just need to come up with a different set of assumptions, right? And I can tell you what's happening in this pro forma that's causing them to lose cash like this is the way that their member loans are structured. So they need to go back and rethink how they want to do their member loans, or maybe change to preferred shares. But you can see that EBITDA, so it is possible. I know it sounds weird. It looks weird. It sounds weird, but it is possible to have positive net income from operations, but be running out of money, right? And that's that kind of the different pieces affecting. Some pieces are affecting your income statement. Some pieces are affecting your cash flow, but not everything is affecting all of them at once, right? So this is what those outcomes look like. And this is a co-op that probably will open, right? Just not with this scenario. And that actually is the end of my slideshow. So it is 7:52. Thank you for coming. And I can stop sharing, and then we can if there's other questions, or we can just end it. So let me do that.
See, there's already one question. I'm going to see if there are any others want to pop up in the chat, or if anyone wants to raise their hands. Okay. So this one's kind of going off a little bit of a little off target, but they wanted to know if you can explain preferred shares. I thought maybe the more valid part would be to explain kind of like why preferred shares versus loans might make a difference in the pro forma.
Yeah, sure. And I'll try to keep it simple. So a preferred share it's a share. So instead of it being a loan, where you would actually be signing a promissory note with that owner with a specific interest rate and a specific maturity date. And then that comes into your balance sheet as debt, right? And when you pay the interest on that, that's being deducted in your income statement, because that's debt. A share, it's a different way of investing equity into your co-op. So it's not coming in as debt, it's actually coming in as equity. So your balance sheet looks a lot better. Now, here's the thing though. You still have to model, you still have to figure out, are you going to pay a dividend to these shareholders? And if you are, when is that going to start? And then you also should be thinking about, when are you going to allow people to redeem shares, right? So if members are investing in your co-op and they're making loans, all of those loans have maturity dates. So some of your owners might be making a 5-year loan, some of them might be making a 7-year loan or a 10-year loan, but you know when that principal is going back to them, right? With a preferred share, you still need to be thinking about repayment, only because not everybody in your community is necessarily going to want to make that investment with not knowing when I would ever get it back, if ever, right? So it's good to kind of plan for, are you going to let people get their money back, right? And when, right? But it's equity, not debt. And then dividends also, they're not guaranteed, right? So if your co-op is not doing as well as you'd like it to, then maybe the board doesn't pay a dividend to its preferred shareholders. No voting rights. I should also come in and say that. It's not voting stock, right? Membership stock is voting stock, and that's one owner, one vote. So nobody ever gets more voting rights by buying preferred shares. Oh, you're muted.
Yep. You have even more questions about preferred shares. I knew this was going to open up a can of worms. So I'm going to actually hold this because that's not how they affect these. So why not start with preferred shares or loans? Real quick, some states don't allow, co-op statutes don't allow preferred shares, and that's often the biggest reason. But it also can be that it depends on the type of community you have. Some folks need to know when they're getting their money back and prefer a loan, and they know that exactly their interest is and exactly when they're get their money back. Preferred shares tend to appeal much more to people who have larger amounts of money to invest. So it will depend on your type of community, what might be more successful for you. It's a whole topic. So we can definitely touch on that some other time. Other questions about, we could take one more question about, or one or two more questions here about what Siobain has been sharing with us here today, or about the proformas. Anyone else? All right.
Okay.
All right. Well, if that is the case, if that's where everyone is tonight, actually, I'm impressed with you all asking so many questions so late in the day. But we'll take that pause and just say thank you to Siobain for coming and joining us and teaching us and instructing us around this topic. We really appreciate it. And I think she did a terrific job. Coming up tomorrow, we've got 2 more days of sessions. Tomorrow morning, we go in a completely different direction. We're going to talk about point of sale systems. What are they? You as a board may end up having to choose it before the GM can show up. It's one of the most important purchases you'll make for your future store. Come learn all about what it is and how to make that decision. I'm really excited. Tomorrow night, we will have a case study with the Fertile Ground Food Co-op, and Simone Bullock is going to be here talking about how they finally chose a communications project management system for the board to utilize after years of organizing that is really working for them, how they picked it, how they got everyone on board, what's working, what's still maybe not, and come learn from their experience. And then on Thursday, we have a case study from the Rise Community Market, the only startup food court that has opened more recently than Assabet. They opened just about a week and a half ago. And this is in a tiny little town called Cairo, Illinois. Very low population, 75% Black. And they have opened a very small community market there that is so far doing very, very well. And we're going to have a live case study with them. So don't miss that. We hope you'll join us. And one last thank you, of course, to all of our sponsors for our summer 2023 series who have made it possible.